Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by Loughborough University. This podcast seeks to bring together the worlds of academia and professional practice. If you're interested in the latest research and trends in sport, then this is the podcast for you.
Hi Ed, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure, good to see you.
Really nice to meet you. So today we're going to talk about your time as Chief Selector for England Cricket. We're going to look at your recent book-making decisions and the development of the Institute of Sports Humanities. But before we do, can you provide our listeners with a bit of a background into your experiences that have led to where you are now?
Of course, and great to be on the podcast with you and to chat to your network in this format. So I've had a range of different experiences or careers, if you like. First of all, I was a professional cricketer, and then I was principally a writer, and then I came back into professional sport at the sharp end as head of selection for England cricket for 3 years, from 2018 to 2021. Alongside the last sort of 5 years of doing other stuff, a major focus for me has been setting up the Institute of Sports Humanities, which you touched upon. And I'm really excited about the new partnership with Loughborough University, which led to this conversation, and the campus at London at the 2012 Olympic Park, where Loughborough London is. And in conjunction with Loughborough London, the Institute of Sports Humanities, which is focused on leadership for sports industry professionals, helping captains, coaches, technical directors, MDs to have a greater impact within their organisation. And together with Loughborough London, this autumn we launched the Masters Leadership in Sport, which is a very exciting project, and everyone at ISH is super keen to get cracking with.
It's really exciting time for looking at that project that you have, and I know we're going to touch upon that later on. There's other podcasts. I'm not sure if you know. Do you know John Steele, who's at Loughborough?
I do know. I know about John. Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So leadership in sport, we have a podcast that we've done with John. It's outstanding. So if you want to look at other people who might want to contribute, I would definitely recommend looking at what John does, because he's been exceptional. But before we get touching upon that, we're gonna talk about decision making. But obviously the Ashes is coming up this summer, so I thought it was a timely piece to ask you a few questions on the Ashes. So what's your favourite experience, most memorable moment of the Ashes?
That's such a good question, and I'm going to have to mention a couple. I was only 4 in 1981, but the legend of 81 lived very strongly in our family through a personal connection with Mike Brearley, who was the same year in the same college at university as my father, and they knew each other well and still do. Looking at great moments in sport through the lens of leadership was very much part of the way we talked about sport at home, and Mike's influence in that series, which became this legend, this mythic, magical ability to conjure victory when it seemed so improbable. That was something that, my dad in particular would talk about, how Mike approached teams, how he thought about galvanizing groups. So that was something that, although I can't say the match itself, age 4, would be lying if I said I recall it vividly, but that legend was something that has a big part of my backstory, if you like. 1985, I'm a little bit clearer that I definitely am watching the television when someone who'd been at my school, Richard Ellison, actually swung the Ashes in England's favour. One of those great stories when someone who didn't play that much for England but was a very good player on his day, a sort of classy swing bowler, had a huge impact in the last 2 Test matches when David Gower was captain and England won those Ashes. So that was another moment I remember very vividly. It was 85. And then, more recently, of course, my generation, even though I was not playing, but I played for England just 3 Test matches in 2003. And one of the things I felt very clear about in that sort of small snapshot of experience was that we were entering the period of Andrew Flintoff. So I'd been the same year as Andrew. And of course, we all knew he was an incredible talent, very engaging person, charismatic, incredibly gifted. But the question was always with Freddie, as everyone else knows him, would he have a spell where he was really dialed in and focused and fit and all the rest of it? And that period probably began in 2003, and then 2003, 4, 5, Flintoff was at his best. And of course, some of the stuff in that series, which was such a brilliant series across the board, but I think Flintoff's over at Ponting, and the way he kind of kept popping up in that series when England needed him. That was an incredible thing for everyone that knew him to kind of observe, because it's always great when talent comes to fruition.
That's brilliant. I mean, leading towards Flintoff probably takes me exactly to my experience in the Ashes. So my background in terms of cricket was more realistically, friends played it and I watched, and I was football all the way. And really, would watch England on TV, but I really got into the Ashes in 2005, and I managed to somehow get through means of people I know knowing how to get into Trent Bridge for free. I was there at day 5 at Trent Bridge in Nottingham when we beat them, and actually randomly ended up on the balcony next to Freddie Flintoff's wife. I have a picture somewhere celebrating with the players' wives. Anyway, that's a long story, but that got me into it. The Flintoff kind of era, getting the Ashes back in 2005. I ended up at Edgbaston as well, day 5 at Edgbaston. But my pinnacle was definitely the Boxing Day test at the MCG. My wife had never been to a cricket match before. We lived in Sydney. And for Christmas, being the loving husband that I am, I thought it would be a great idea to buy a ticket for the Boxing Day test at the MCG. Like I said, she'd never been to cricket before. The swing back was the shopping in Melbourne's meant to be really good. So it was like 3 days in Melbourne. We're going cricket day 1. Day 2, we can go shopping. And day 1, I don't know if you would remember this at all, but day 1 Boxing Day test in Melbourne, I literally have a photo in my office. I'm looking at it right now. It was Australia were all out for 98, and England finished the day on 157 for 0. Now, that has to be, in my opinion, the greatest Ashes day ever. That was the crowd. I'm looking at it now. It was 84,345. So my wife's introduction to the Ashes was that. We woke up the next day and said, we're going to go shopping. She went, can we go cricket again? And we got tickets and went day 2 as well. It was amazing. And then I ended up also being at the test in day 5 in Sydney, and, fair play to the Australian Cricket Board. It was, we needed like 2 more wickets. We'd already won the Ashes. We needed 2 more wickets. So therefore it was free entry on day 5. And there was 40,000 England fans and about 3 Aussies in the stadium. So it was incredible atmosphere. So yeah, I've had some unbelievable days. So I've been to the Ashes 5 times and we've won every single time.
So the takeaway from this story is we need to get you at Edgbaston and Lords and all the rest this summer. So we'll message Rob Key now and see if we can get the lucky charm.
Definitely. I am still disappointed that the men's fixture is not at Trent Bridge this year, obviously, but there's the women's fixture is going to be at Trent Bridge, isn't it, as well? So that's interesting, and will be really good. But yeah,
the captain of the women's team, Heather Knight, is a alumni of the Institute of Sports Humanities. She actually graduated with distinction this spring. So yes, and I've been close to the women's team through Heather's work, and obviously she played in the women's IPL. And this is one of those moments, isn't it, in the trajectory of one aspect of the sport, which is incredibly exciting. I don't think anyone could have predicted that women's cricket would develop as quickly. First of all, with the 100 and sharing the stage, and what that's done for, when you go to a 100 game and both fixtures, that's brought a huge amount of attention to the women's game. And also then the launch of the women's IPL this spring, just I think the sky's the limit for where women's cricket can get to in the next few years.
I think you're totally right. And interestingly, from that, the professional side of it and the high profile that's now growing, women's cricket at development level is growing. So I live in a village called Farnsfield, so really, really small village in Nottingham. Tennis club one side, and we have a cricket club the other side. And the cricket club is the first year this year that they have women's specific and girls specific coaching going on. And so my daughter's playing over there, and it's brilliant. Every Friday night we're down there. So it's growing at all levels. So that's really exciting for women's cricket as well. Anyway, we're not here to talk about cricket and my daughter and all that kind of thing. We're here to talk about you. So can you give us a bit of an insight in your role as Chief Selector? Like, why did you get the role, and what was it like when you first entered the scene?
I don't know if I can answer why I got it. I can probably answer why I came back into sport, which was a surprise to myself. I was very happy. I was writing a book. I'd just started a new series for Radio 4. I'd launched the Institute. The working world, although I'm always open-minded about what might come next, I was pretty happy and fulfilled with what I was doing. And Andrew Strauss got in touch with me. He was running England cricket at that time, and they were interested in taking selection in a new direction. And initially I said no, and I was sort of flat out with other things. And then kind of my heart took over a little bit, and I found myself thinking about it a lot. And I realized that one of the things I've been very interested in the 10 years following my playing career was how you might find an edge through decision making and particularly recruitment to create winning teams. Been interested in the Moneyball revolution, having spent some time in baseball writing my first book in the early 2000s. And then the relationship between sports analytics, which is, of course, a growing and very important field, and then how that fits together with intuition, insight, judgment, which are, of course, very human qualities, which I don't think ever can be staffed out to an algorithm or a computer. How did those two aspects of life that I was very interested in come together in the pursuit of effectively more wins in the final column? There's a part of me, which is the writer, the analyst, the academic, which stands back and tries to make sense of things. And then there's another part of me, which is the practitioner that just wants to get it done. And occasionally my conscience says, enough with the trying to understand how other people do it. Maybe you need some skin in the game and see what you've got. Selection was always an area where I felt confident as a player and a captain. You know, you've got the tools you've got, and everyone is weaker and stronger in different ways. In my case, as a captain, I felt that one of my weaker areas was I'm naturally very contained. So I was never going to be the most sociable captain. I was never going to be the last person in the bar. I was never going to be someone who just lived and breathed for more and more and more time with the guys, because I needed my space and I needed my solitude. So I felt there was a weakness there. Where I felt strong was I felt very confident that I could add value through selection. And that was something that I kept a track of in my own mind. Always when you're wrong as well. I definitely kept a track of the times when I've been surprised by people who had been better than I thought, and also surprised by people who hadn't turned out as well as I thought they would. But I'd often been asked for my views on selection, even when I was a very young player. Sometimes when I was even one of those players contending, and the coach would still ask me, which I always found both flattering and slightly strange, And then when it was my turn to be captain, and we have this quirk in cricket where the captain still has significant sway over the final 11, even if the coach in county cricket or the selectors in international cricket, are more responsible for the squad when it comes to the final 11. That usually is the captain's decision. And that was an area where I felt pretty confident that I could help the team. Then I got very interested in American sport and in football. And in American sport and in football, which are both much richer sports than cricket, recruitment, talent ID, selection have been a major focus and have benefited from a lot of resources being diverted in that direction. And I felt I could probably use my experiences in those areas and bring them into cricket, which is what we did. Finally, a lot of my work in my 30s, accidentally, and I never intended it to become practically useful in cricket, but had circled around questions of risk, probability, skepticism, how you make decisions. I've been interested in behavioral economics. I've written a book about luck, which of course touches on all those themes inevitably. I thought there was a way that you could bring those ideas into cricket. It was a very rich academic and intellectual period for those ideas. And yet sometimes when I was in cricketing conversations, I felt the conversation was stuck in the past. So that was what excited me. It was bringing ideas into cricket, both from academia and also from other sports. It was testing myself in the real world, so I'd get that thrill of having a stake, of being invested in decisions rather than just an observer. And also, I think there's something in everyone who's been involved with England cricket. If you get the opportunity to try to make a contribution to England winning more, it kind of is very hard to say no. Then I was hugely lucky in that Andrew Strauss and Mo Bobat, who is now performance director, but Mo was then head of talent ID, had done something very clever, which was they were trying to modernize talent ID and selection, but also stay close to what makes cricket special and unique. There is a tradition of independent selection, which is that everyone knows the captain has a huge amount to do in cricket and is a very important voice. But you don't want him to become overburdened with absolutely everything because he's got enough on his plate already. So he needs to be central to the conversation, but not sort of weighed down by picking and choosing everything and everyone. Then you've got the coach who is very closely observed 24/7 in cricket. It's not like Pep Guardiola, who can come in and do training for 2 hours and inspire people and then go away again and protect his distance. The coach in cricket is kind of constantly observed in the dressing room. He shares that physical space with his players all the time. So distance can be quite difficult. And then thirdly, perhaps those two reasons, but certainly historically, there had been a role for people just one step removed who had that independence and perspective on what was going on. And then, of course, were the selectors. So that was the tradition of cricket. And then there was this whole development of scouting, data, improved information, and whether we could make more reliable predictions about who was going to succeed in the next level up. And so what Mo and Andrew had done is they'd almost created a new department, which was the talent ID department, and aligned it with the selection department. And then that came together in my old role, national selector, head of selection, whatever you want to call it, which I felt benefited hugely from very, very good information, excellent scouting, very good data analyst, in particular, the analyst I work with closely, Nathan Lehman, and other very good sources of information. And then you kind of have all the information in different forms. And then I think your job is to weigh and reconcile that information in the best way possible. And I was very fortunate to work with James Taylor as my co-selector. Now, here's the point, and this is where it connects back to the Institute of Sports Humanities and the course with Loughborough University, London. Any selection decision is interdisciplinary by definition. You're going to be drawing on, there's going to be data, there's going to be scouting information, there's going to be coaching feedback, there's going to be what you're observing with your own eyes, and there's going to be a whole series of intuitive assessments of that player, which you may not fully understand, even though they're within you. And you've got to try and bring all those different sources of information and different weightings and different influences together in a way that's both fair, sufficiently transparent, although probably not totally transparent, and yet also true to your own voice as a selector. Over time, and this is come almost rushing to the end of it, but why not, given that we're discussing it now? Over time, I realized that my first instinct when coming back into selection in 2018, which was how could we use data and scouting, approximate term, something like optimized selection so that we got the right team every time, or some kind of enlightenment, overconfidence. I moved much more towards the position that my value as a human being, as someone who made judgments and had intuition and insight, was when I diverged from what the data said. So if you're going to actually add any value, you have to diverge a little bit from the data, otherwise the algorithm can do it. And you have to diverge somewhat from conventional wisdom. Because if you only ever do what everyone else would do on average, again, you have no value. You're just a sinecure, really. And there's a great line by the American investor Howard Marks, who's a brilliant writer and thinker about investment decisions. And he says, in order to have the benefit of being different and better, you have to bear the risk of being different and worse. And that's actually selection in one sentence. If they're saying in the newspapers, we would do something slightly different, you're left field, you're not doing the sensible thing, then you have a chance at adding some value. If they never say that, and they just always say, oh, there's no such thing as a singular they, but you know what I mean. If conventional wisdom is always happy, you shouldn't have a job. You're not adding any value. It's only when you perceive value that others miss. That's the value of a selector.
There's so many insights you've put in there already that I got out of the book. And obviously you've mentioned there's so many examples in your book from other sports and taking some of those great ideas from other sports, bringing them into cricket. You've already quoted there that there's great thinkers in this book as well that you've brought in from other fields, whether it be history or other areas, that have really seemed to have added value to this whole area of decision making. And you've touched upon everything that we're going to go through in a bit more depth. I think one of my really things I really liked at the start, hopefully not misquoting you here, you said that in terms of decisions, when you were thinking about decision to become a selector and your heart versus your head, you said that's when you know there's no decision to make at all. You've already made it. There's that feeling inside, and you can look at all the data, you can look at whatever you like, but I think that kind of could cover not just you becoming an England selector, but you get that feeling inside that makes that decision for you, which I think is, you mentioned there, listening to your own voice and all those kind of things, which I think are really important and probably difficult challenges for people in a situation where you have got all this data and the data says this, but you're just feeling something else. And that's a real challenge to be kind of have the confidence to say that. And I think we'll touch upon in a bit more depth all of those things in a moment. I think the other bit you picked up on as well, you mentioned interdisciplinary teams. And I've spoken to a number of people on the podcast, whether it's around performance analysis or psychologists, often it's around this. And my first role after university was as a strength and conditioning coach. And I thought, absolute dream job. I lasted about 6 months. I just didn't like the environment. But at the time, it was certainly, this is 20 years ago, it was certainly a multidisciplinary approach, which was more, you've got the strength and conditioning department, you've got the psychology department, you've got probably not performance analysis, but just about arriving at performance analysis back then. But they're all separate departments. and people or players went to the different department to get their different thing. And I think now this interdisciplinary approach, where actually the coach and the performance analyst and the strength and conditioning coach and the psychologist all come together to get a holistic understanding, I think it's been a great move for everybody in sport. So when you first came in, all those things we've just talked about, and you also mentioned tradition, they probably weren't already happening in England cricket at the time, or were they just started to happen? How did you kind of...
Well, it's hard to know what was in place before because you're not there. I think the way I would see it, and based on my conversations with the people who had continuity both sort of before, during, was that we refined and radicalized a process that was just getting going, whilst also staying close to some traditional elements which have been there all along. So it was both a restoration and a kind of revolution maybe at once. And a couple of things. Firstly, I think all those forms of information we touched on earlier have value, but none of them should overbalance the whole. So if you take you right into a room, and in that room you've got the head of selection and co-selector, so that's me and James Taylor. You've got the head of scouting, Mo Bobat, at that point. You've got the data analyst, Nathan Lehman. You've maybe got the acting director of cricket, Andy Flower, in my first year, 2018. He's been a great coach himself. And then you've got the head coach, let's say Trevor Bayliss and Paul Farbrace. And then you've got the captain as well. Now, in that room, there's someone that knows more than me about scouting, and that's Mo Bobat. There's three people that know more about coaching, Trevor Bayliss and Andy Flower. There's someone who knows more about data. There's someone who has got a closer feel of where the players are at, and that's the captain. But maybe your value is that no one sees it all. No one's job is to spend their time looking at the whole thing and how does it all fit together in the pursuit of a team that wins more. I think there's that combination of necessary humility, not fake humility. Like, you genuinely know for sure that you're talking to someone that's won the Ashes twice as a coach. You're not going to tell them about coaching, or someone who's won the World Cup in different formats. You're not going to say, there's no voice in your head that thinks you know more than they do about coaching. But where you might have your value is that you're across it all and you feel confident in each area to know how much weighting to give that particular discipline in that particular decision. And that was, I think, one of the areas in which we were strong for a while. There was a lot of mutual respect, but also people knew who was doing what. I think the other thing is that you're effectively trying to solve a set of connected problems, which is how do we get more performance out of the teams through the lever of selection? They're your tools, they're your levers, and that's your challenge. And it's very unclear how you would define what work is in that context. You're living with it all the time. So one of the things I found was that you're moving in and out of closer and wider focus all the time. There are times when you're very close to use the sort of art or painting analogy, at times when you're very close to the canvas, you're at the ground, you're around the team, you're trying to absorb everything subliminally about where people are at, you're around the hotel, you're soaking it up, you want all the information, you want to make sure that you're not missing anything. And then there are times when you go back again and you use a more wide-angled perspective and you're trying to see where the team might get to, what might make a difference over the medium term, how you might be positioning players to come into the group who could take it forward. And there's that thing of going closer and then further back, closer and further back. And sometimes people would say, oh, there must be a tension between the short and the long term. And you must always have been thinking about the medium and long term. And there must have been loads of rows about the coach or whatever always trying to win the here and now. I said, not really. I wanted to win the here and now too. I also had an eye on the medium and the long term, but probably the more important tension is between closer and further back. And there's no right answer to that. And I think that's true for leadership in general. I don't think there is a right answer to how much do you need to be on the shop floor and how much you need to be removed from it, other than the fact that you're going constantly or up and down that spectrum or closer and further away from the canvas. And that's one area I think where having independent selection, which is the role that Rob Key now has done very well in combination with being managing director as well, and then Luke Wright's come on board to assist him. I think there's a danger you can get swamped by being totally involved all the time and you lose perspectives. I think there's also a danger in being not involved enough and too distant, and then maybe you lack nuance and you lack feel. So that was one of the challenges, on a kind of daily basis. In terms of systems, to what extent was it in place? I think we certainly developed it in several ways. I'm very agnostic about structure. So when the end of my time at England Cricket, they actually abolished the role of head of selection, and they moved towards the head coach being the sole selector. They then reversed that and gone back to something more like what we had from 2018 to 2021. But I don't think that life is ever all about structure. I don't think there's a wholly right structure and a wholly wrong structure. It depends on the people involved. And I was always kind of agnostic about what that looked like. When things are working well, no one cares about reporting lines. They never come up. Organizational charts are left where they should be left, which is in the sort of fantasy drawer of the administrator that's in charge of who line manages who. In actual fact, there's such a sense of deep responsibility among all the protagonists. It never comes up who's in charge of who. It's far more collaborative than that. So I would say, in terms of what's the right structure, it's more important that you've got the right people. A good structure can support the right people and help them, but it can never make up for people who aren't good enough. And in the same way, I would say that, so if you had to choose between the two, I'd always say good people with a kind of loose structure which sorts itself out, rather than a perfectly, impressive structure and then, not such perfect fits in terms of appointments. So I think we were very lucky at the beginning in particular that there was a very exciting period of time.
I think you're right with getting the right people on the bus is one of those phrases that people use. I think that might be a Jim Collins one. I think you quoted Jim in your book. But in terms of the process, so you talk, structure, maybe it's loose and different environments, different things work. I know in the book you talk about process and anti-process, and I found that really interesting. Can you talk a little bit around that?
I think that's the heart of the matter, process, anti-process. And it's the middle chapter of the book. It's just called process/anti-process. And that is the heart of the book in a way, because I'm the son of a novelist and an art teacher. And I got interested in sports analytics, and I was probably more interested in data when I was a captain and then in my 30s than most people. But over time, I came to see selection and thinking about teams as a creative enterprise in which perhaps the most important bits can't be fully understood. That's the anti-process. Alongside that, you need a very good process, but it's never complete. No process is complete. You can't just run the process and get to the right answer, in my opinion. You're always going to have to interrogate it and to refine it through the human element too, the judgment, the intuition, the insight. And therefore there's a tension, although not necessarily a conflict, between doing things robustly, a little bit quasi-scientifically, fairly, and in a repeatable way. So it's something a bit like that next time as well. That's process. It needs to be good. It will help you filter out errors and it will catch mistakes. And then there's also how you live your life and how you try and maximize your openness to new ideas, to creativity, to insight. Now, in my experience, that's very rarely by being in meetings all the time. So you need to protect yourself from being swamped by the machine. Now, the original subtitle of the book for the hardback was Putting the Human Back in the Machine. Now, what do I mean by machine? Well, there's machine in two different senses. There's machine learning, AI. So how does the human mind work in tandem with a field which is accelerating even far faster than I knew it would when I finished the book a year ago? Where's the value of human thinking in the era of AI? That's part one definition of machine. The second definition is a kind of organizational machine. 400 employees at the ECB, a lot of people scheduling meetings all the time. A big organization is a huge bureaucracy. That's true whether you work in the NHS or whether you work in a big school or whether you work for a sports governing body or a corporate. They are big machines. And machines develop tastes, habits, preferences of their own. And sometimes it feels as though human beings are actually being squeezed into the needs of the machine rather than the machine being organized around the needs of human beings. And you have to, if you're not going to solve that, and, I wasn't going to in 3 years as selector, which was, not really a particularly administrative role, you're going to have to fight it through your own, hopefully polite, but nonetheless robust protection of your own space and your own ideas. And if I was being self-critical, which I often am in the book, when I went through my notebooks of those 3 years, one thing that disappointed me was that the things I wrote down became less creative over 3 years. It became a bit more like, don't forget to call X, Y, Z, ABC, don't forget to do this, this, and this. And I'll be like, how have I gone from this is the solution, get it done, to don't forget to keep everyone in the loop? Now, of course, I'm exaggerating a little bit to prove a point, but it shows, I think, the importance that when people hire someone in a decision-making role, Usually what they want is that person's judgment. They want them to add value somehow. They've got to retain the ability to add value. Otherwise, they need to move on and do something else. And yet, organizations make greater and greater demands on people in terms of compliance and bureaucratic form filling and all the rest of it, or even just attendance. You never want people to feel, if they're decision makers, that there's any presenteeism. So that requires, I think, a constant struggle and acceptance of tension. And one of the ways in which I try to work with people when they're working within my team is to stay close to the instinct which says, how do I add value? How do I add value? Rather than I've always got to be in the room in case something happens that leaves me feeling vulnerable. Or presenteeism is the enemy of creativity. There's a very good reason why creative talents don't reply to every text message, because if they did, they wouldn't do any creating. Which is another thing about communication, process and anti-process. Communication is very important, but you can communicate too much as well as too little. Anyone that says to you, it's all about communication, I've never met anyone who said that was any good. What they mean is, they feel comfortable recycling information all the time. That's what they want to do. They want to gain information and then recycle it. And they're basically kind of like a pipeline of information. Well, that may be fine at a certain level, but it's got nothing to do with decision making. And it's got nothing to do with creating great teams. Communication is important, but first of all, you've got to have something to communicate. And that's going to require struggle and tension and probably imagination and intuition. I feel that many organizations I've observed in different spheres, whether that's academia or elite sport or media, there's actually a tendency that people get sucked into explicitly anti-creative behavior, which makes them less good at their job to the detriment of the organization that hires them.
Definitely. I mean, you've touched upon loads of things there. That's lots of it in the book around kind of tradition and hierarchy. And, many people have, in my opinion, meetings for the sake of having a meeting. And so when it comes to the selection process, how did you use some of this stuff to help you really? The process, anti-process.
Well, the process part was very rigorous. And we every meeting, there would be data insights. There'd be sort of well-being report about players' mental and physical state. There would be scouting insights. Then we'd go through a particular way of analyzing the problem. What were the team's needs? What was the nature of this particular challenge or series or event? So you'd look, there were very highly structured aspects to it. But in the way you go about your daily life, when people say, can we have a meeting? I usually say, well, let's start with a conversation, see what happens. So what do you want to talk about? People love like popping meetings into the diary. Well, why don't we have a conversation? If we need to have a meeting as well, we'll do that. And I think that there's a slight kind of sense that, no, not a slight sense. Often people have their best ideas collaboratively when they don't know they're working. There's a reason why people have interesting conversations at cricket matches. There's a reason why people have interesting conversations when they're driving together and they're not looking at each other across the table. There's a reason why people have interesting conversations when they're walking, because the process of doing something else makes them almost accidentally say what they feel a bit more than they would if it was a highly formal environment. And I cite in the book working with a great newspaper editor, legendary Fleet Street editor, who'd kind of ambush you and suddenly he'd be standing next to you in the newspaper and he'd say, what do you think about this story? And you'd sort of say, and he'd go, yeah, I agree, a load of rubbish. And then you'd kind of have these off the cuff conversations where he would just get out of it what he wanted. You were not being judged. And people very seldom tell the truth when they think they're being judged. So you have to get to that voice, which is what they really think. And that, of course, includes yourself. You have to learn to ambush yourself. Bob Dylan had this great line that creativity is not a train running down the tracks. You can't just say, that's the direction and now I'm moving it. You have to be a bit savvier than that with yourself. You have to try and ambush your deeper thoughts so that you can get to stuff that your conscious mind might get in the way of. And of course, you need accomplices in that. You need co-conspirators to jolt you into your better ideas. And when any group is working well, whether it's a band or a team, it's a cliche, but it's a true cliche. The sum is more than the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And that's something that I explored in 2 chapters in the book through the lens of recruitment, which is the 2 chapters being Swarm Harmonizer and Lego. Now, if you like, the off-field group trying to create an environment which adds up to more than the individual parts, The same thing very much applies to the on-field group. I've always been very interested in, balance and harmony in a sports team, by which I don't mean everyone being nice to each other, by the way. But when you think about rugby, one of the most fascinating selection challenges for rugby coaches and selectors is how you balance a back row. You need a certain amount of ball carrying ability. You need a certain amount of jackling and tackling ability. You need a certain amount of line out ability. And often it's the case that the need for balance will dictate, who gets the nod over the 4 or 5 good back row players, the 3 that make it onto the field. It's often a question of how that fits together. And often a very, very good player will not get selected because it doesn't fit the team's balance. In the same way in football, how a football team fits together, first of all, in terms of recruitment, and secondly, in terms of formation, which obviously formation will change according to the opposition if you've got a sophisticated coach. That's such a huge part of winning. And you see when teams get it wrong and they just recruit loads and loads of expensive players, and there's no sense of how that's going to come together. And then on the flip side, you look at how well Brighton have recruited, and actually that's very data informed. Obviously, a very smart owner in Tony Bloom, but also a very enlightened machine in that whole setup at Brighton. And they don't buy expensive players that don't fit in. That's just not part of their DNA. So I think the way you think about fitting pieces together. Now, within that, there are times when you may have to leave someone out who's a very good player because the team somehow has different needs at that point. And that was actually a very good line that Mo Bobat was just come back to. What does England need? That's the question we should be anchoring to in our meeting. Now, I was always interested in team output. That was the goal. And obviously individuals contribute to team output through their personal performances, but team output was the goal. Could you add wins to the team across the 3 formats? Could you add wins in T20s, in tests and in ODIs? And over the course of the whole sort of 3 years, we were 7 out of 10 across the 3 formats, all of them in terms of win-loss. So someone like Sam Curran, who we picked when he was 19 in Test cricket, and I don't think many people had him on the radar at that stage. First of all, there are many voices that went into that. We knew a lot about him. We knew a lot about him from school, from the England pathway on the 19s, from Surrey. We also knew a lot about England's needs. England had a very unvaried bowling attack. Very good bowlers, but all bowling in the low 80s, right arm over. Now, that might work if you're playing on a very difficult batting pitch where the ball that lands just outside off stump and clips the middle of off. If you bowl that all day long, it's going to be good enough to get them all out. But not every test pitch is like that. And when you come on different surfaces, which might flatten out or not reward conventional right arm fast medium bowling as much, that's where you need players who contribute to a varied attack. So a left arm swing bowler like Sam Curran, a very fast bowler like Jofra Archer or Mark Wood, obviously spin, particularly if it's, unusual spin, but certainly spin regardless. Those things add up to an attack, which is asking different questions of the batsman. So it's not just a question of getting in, and then when you're in, it's just kind of carrying on from a batting perspective, which is what you want as a batsman. And Sam Curran, brought not only that swing, angle, different voice as a bowler, but also exuberant competitiveness, fearlessness, counter-attacking batting, and someone who was deep down a performer, who was always better on the field during the match than he sort of showed, in a kind of relatively humdrum practice environment. So the fascinating thing about Sam Curran is, that when he's played for England, particularly in Tests and in T20s, where he's now kind of regarded as an outstanding player and was man of the series in the successful World Cup win by England, he seems to make a disproportionate contribution to England winning. England win more than they otherwise do when he's on the field. Now, I don't think that's an accident, even though I think some of that may have more going on there than is easy to explain. So he was an example of someone who helped the team win. It's also true that, and Sam's a very exciting player, so that might not surprise people at one level. It's also true that when you're choosing between players who have very similar records, it may be a very different type of characteristic or quality that tilts the conversation towards one player rather than another. I'll give you an example, and I'm not, this is no implied criticism. I'm not saying that they should bring him back at this stage or whatever. I'm just saying one of the reasons why he had a long run in the team. Keaton Jennings did a very difficult job for England, and so did Joe Denley. They both were kind of the last pick batter, so they'd been recalled or brought into the England team when things were very hard at the top of the order. And lots of people had come in as opening batsmen, and Rory Burns actually did a good job for a couple of years too. And they were up against the Duke cricket ball in England with world-class bowlers, and the movement was very considerable, and lots of people were finding it very hard to stay in the team for a long time. And when I started as selector, there'd been a pretty quick kind of in and out. Guys are getting 5, 7, 9 games, which sounds like a lot compared to some eras, but they're in and out, and then someone else. Now, the person who can do that role, or the player can do that role, and not take any energy away from the group, to be totally unself-pitying, to front up every day, do the best they can do, not to obsess too much about whether or not they're going to get dropped, just to carry on batting as well as they can in really difficult circumstances, putting the team first through their demeanour as well as through their batsmanship. That person brings value to the team that maybe isn't clear from the boundary edge. And that was another example of, in the chapter on Lego, when you're looking at building a winning team, you don't want to go too far down that road. It's never about picking nice guys, or I'm not saying that. I'm not saying you don't have space for difficult or, quirky people too, because of course you want people that don't fit the mold. But when it comes to very difficult roles where England have found it traditionally hard to find the solution, I always said, if someone's doing it okay and they're contributing to the team in a broader way, are we sure that we want to be moving away from that person? So those guys got typically longer runs in the team than was normal. And of course, that's when the heat will come on you as a selector. And I never liked feeling that selection decisions were made defensively to appease the media. That was never going to be the way we did it. We were like, we're there to take the heat. And if we're backing someone, then that's fine with us. And if people want to say their favourite or whatever, that's fine. Again, that's evidence that you're doing your job.
I think there's so much we could go into, and we're running out of time. The Swarm harmoniser and having that player or those players and them bringing others together, fitting the right pieces into the right places. There's loads of detail of that in the book, and in terms of enhancing decision making. We've not touched upon the weighted averages that again is in the book, and around how you are using that data in a slightly different way, not such a simplistic way, to understand what's actually going on. We can all look at the data that they tell you on the TV and go, well, this player should be playing, or how they're performing in county cricket is really important. But actually, some of the depth that you talk about in the book really gives a good understanding to people on that decision. So I'll let them go to the book to touch on that. I wanted to skip on because I know we've both got to be away. I really did want to talk about Jofra Archer a little bit and the Super Over, but we're going to skip that. People go and read the book because it's brilliant. So
we should talk about the Institute and Loughborough.
The final thing to touch upon is that the Institute and Loughborough. So a lot of this has brought you to develop the Institute. So what is it? What is the course? And then I've got a final question for you as well.
Sure. So the course is the MA Leadership in Sport, and it's an interdisciplinary course drawing on history, psychology, sociology, a whole range of different tools that is geared towards helping people who've got busy jobs already. They might be captaining the England cricket team like Heather Knight, or they might be working in the sports industry in another area, where we want to help them to have more impact on their teams and their organizations. And we've devised a course based around people who are very busy, but very ambitious and want to get better. They want to move to the next level, and they want to have the tools to do so. We're very excited about the partnership with Loughborough. Loughborough is obviously the world's best sports university. Has a whole range of competencies and expertise in the sports space. This was a particularly exciting partnership because we have a sort of niche network of thinkers and practitioners in the sports industry. And Loughborough obviously has that great depth and texture across the academic spectrum. So it felt like a perfect way to come together. We launch in autumn. Applications are open, whether through the Loughborough website, or you can get in touch with us at the Institute of Sports Humanities too. It all leads to the same place. And one of the things that's very important about the course is that I think people gain most through interesting adjacency. It's when you're sitting next to someone or talking to someone who has a similar and analogous role, but not in a direct compete way. So, if you want to see a sports coach close up, all you have to do is sit next to someone in the same sport. But if you put it next to someone in another sport, I remember from my sort of wide-ranging chats with people in football or Eddie Jones in rugby, you get right into it because, there's no competition and you're not trying to guard a competitive advantage. So we have a very interesting room, and we have a very interesting set of experiences. We go to Sandhurst, we go to places like Google. We try to develop context and academic tools that leave leaders with the best chance of having a greater impact on their team and organisation. So that starts in autumn. And, Loughborough, I was connected with the Vice-Chancellor, Nick Jennings, who, of course, is an AI expert. So in some ways, I just finished the book, but Nick's expertise and my expertise, I'm interested more in the human element, and obviously I'm fascinated by sports data, but I'm also interested in where intelligence, particularly to human beings, has continued relevance. Nick's work is anchored in, the trajectory and opportunity presented by AI, and of course, I think it's the way those two come together, which is going to be central to effective decision making across complex challenges and organizations in the future, as we're learning sort of day by day. So that's ISH. I think, in one sentence, what inspired the Institute of Sports Humanities? I sort of found my own network. For 10 years in my 30s, I was very fortunate to play for 13 years as a professional cricketer. 30, I retired. I kind of went around the world doing different stuff, writing books, magazine articles, broadcasting. And I didn't know what I was doing really. There didn't seem to be any overarching thread. Looking back on it, I was speaking to people that could help me understand how to gain an edge. And then that came together. And what I wanted to do with the Institute was to create an institution that supported restless and independent thought in a way I'd had to go and do it all a little bit on my own to draw that together and make it available to other people to do in a more structured and streamlined way rather than 10 years on the road. So couldn't be more excited about this autumn and getting going with Loughborough, which I know, of course, not only geographically through the Olympic site, but also through its institutional DNA, is a unique place when it comes to sport.
It certainly is. And obviously really exciting to have this course being launched. So we'll certainly put some information about it on the press release. Before you go, because I know we've both got to be in other places, a quick, most really important question. Here's some history and some data for you. England, 32 wins. Australia, 33 wins, 5 draws. Who's going to win the Ashes?
I wouldn't be betting on this year's Ashes, actually. I wouldn't. And it wouldn't surprise me if it was very tight. So I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit. England have a good record at home in the last few years, but I would say a lot will depend on injuries and fitness. So I'd say probably the team that stays fitter across the 5 will win it.
There's a couple of
One thing I would say is that thanks to Brendan McCullum, Rob Key and Ben Stokes, everyone's going to be excited about watching it. So that just goes to show the power of positive leadership to start with.
It's certainly an exciting time for cricket, and people who haven't watched much test cricket may have got involved in ODI or T20 or the 100. Go watch the test because it is absolutely amazing. Ed, massively appreciate it. I could talk to you for absolutely ages about all this stuff. I'm going to leave everyone with a quote from your book, which says, "Decision making in the real world cannot be an exact science. It's about judgment with reference to plenty of evidence." And I think that summarizes lots of the conversation and lots of the thing that decision making, yes, it's about data, but it's also about judgment.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.